All right, today we're jumping into a really interesting text called Cracking the Code. Now, this thing presents a pretty unique and frankly controversial view of how law and commerce work. Our job here is just to break down its core arguments step by step, looking only at what the source itself has to say.
So, right out of the gate, the source makes this huge claim. It says that for thousands of years, a group it calls the legal masters have been building the entire system of world commerce and law that we all operate in. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic way to kick things off, and it really sets the stage for everything else we're about to unpack. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at what it calls the hidden rules of commerce. Then, we'll meet this character called the straw man. After that, we'll get into the power of an affidavit, then this whole debtors versus creditors idea, and finally, how the text says you can reclaim your sovereignty. All right, let's dive into the first part. This is really the bedrock of the whole theory, the foundational claim that everything, and I mean everything, we think of as law is actually just a form of commercial law. So, how does this work? Well, the text points to one specific rulebook that it says governs it all, the Uniform Commercial Code, or UCC. And here's the twist. The argument is that the UCC isn't just for businesses. Nope. The claim is that it applies to literally every interaction between people. And this is where it gets really interesting, you know? The source defines commerce in this super broad way. It's not just about money or buying stuff. It's any and all interchange between people. So, according to this text, that wider definition is the real key to unlocking how this whole system supposedly works. Okay, so if everything is commerce, how do we get pulled into it? Well, according to the source, there's a specific mechanism at play, and it's called the straw man. This slide right here, this is the heart of the straw man idea. The source claims there's a huge difference between your real name, with upper and lowercase letters, and an artificial version that's written in all caps. It calls this all caps version a trade name. And to back this up, the text pulls out a legal term, ens legis. It literally means a creature of the law. So it's saying this straw man isn't a real person, but a legal fiction, kind of like a corporation is an artificial person in the eyes of the law. And where do you see this straw man? Well, the text says to look at your driver's license, your bank statements, any letters from the IRS. It claims that governments and corporations only interact with you using this all caps name. Why? Because supposedly these artificial entities can only legally deal with other artificial entities. Okay, so this is the real kicker. The source claims that whenever you respond to that all caps name, you're unknowingly agreeing to be its surety. Now, a surety is basically someone who agrees to be responsible for someone else's debts and obligations. So the argument is you're on the hook for this straw man. All right, so if that's the setup, what are the rules of the game? How do you operate in this world? Well, the source says the answers lie in what it calls the power of an affidavit. The text argues that this whole commercial system is actually pretty simple. It's supposedly built on just 10 foundational rules, or maxims, and these are presented as the absolute, can't-be-broken laws of how everything works. And out of those 10, these 3 are presented as the most powerful. It all comes down to the affidavit, a sworn statement of truth. The claim is that if you make a statement in an affidavit and nobody challenges it, it becomes the absolute truth, the final judgment, period. And this maxim right here is what makes that whole affidavit thing work. He who leaves the field of battle first loses by default. What does that mean? It means if someone makes a claim against you and you don't answer it, you've basically agreed to it. Your silence is seen as consent. So all these rules create a very specific kind of setup. The text argues that in this whole commercial world, you're one of 2 things. You're either a debtor or you're a creditor. There's no in between. Yeah, it really is a simple binary, as the source puts it, debitor or creditor, the person who owes or the person who is owed. And the textbook claim is that most of us are going through life as debtors without even realizing it. So how do you flip the script and become a creditor? The book says the goal is to achieve the status of sui juris. It's a Latin term that means of his own rights. It basically describes someone who has full legal rights and isn't under anyone else's power. The source presents this as being essentially a sovereign individual. And that brings us to the grand finale, the solution that the source proposes. How do you actually make that shift from being a debtor to a creditor? The text calls this process reclaiming your sovereignty. The method laid out is called redemption. And the whole point of this redemption process is to use the UCC, the same system that supposedly set this all up, to flip it on its head and establish your legal control over that strawman entity. And this is the nuts and bolts of how it's supposedly done. It's a three-step process involving private agreements and public filings. The end goal is to make you the secured party, the one who holds the primary claim over all the property and assets tied to that all-caps version of your name. So we'll wrap up with the big, provocative question that this whole text really leaves you with. If a name can be treated like property, then who actually owns yours?